Right. We're going to get started. This is the Early Years in Education breakout group. Thank you all for coming. My name is Naomi Eisenstadt, and I've been asked to chair this group. I'm a trustee of Trust for London, so I've been part of the advisory group for this piece of work since we started. And I have to say, I feel really proud. I think it's an amazing piece of work. I'm delighted that Trust for London was able to fund it. I was delighted to be part of the advisory group, and also, of course, was very active in arguing that there should be a separate section on under fives and education. So that's really good that we had that. We've got the two key authors, Ruth and Kitty, Kitty we didn't hear from this morning. Ruth you heard from this morning. Kitty Stewart from LSE. And Ruth from Manchester University, and they're going to do a double act. And just to say that we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion. Do you want interruptions, or would you rather go through and?
Should we go through? But we'll try and go through quickly and leave lots of time.
Yeah. Right, and we expect to finish here at about 11:45. I hope that's all right for everybody. And just so that you know, we're being filmed and taped. So if you have a question that you don't want repeated, don't ask it, or ask it quietly afterwards. Right, Ruth and Kitty, please.
Okay, well, thanks for coming, everybody. Welcome. We're going to talk about these three papers from our project, one on under fives, one on schools, and one on further and higher education. So obviously we're just going to present a little flavour of each of those. I should note that two of those, under fives and further and higher education, are out now today, and you've got the summaries. And as Ruth said, the paper on schools will be out a little bit later in February because of the latest GCSE results that are out tomorrow. So Ruth and I are going to present it together in a kind of seamless transition, so you're not even going to notice which one of us is speaking. That's the intention. So we're going to begin by saying a little bit, as the papers begin, by saying a little bit about the Coalition's aims in relation to these areas of spending, these policy areas. And the first one really to highlight, we've heard this morning that right from early on and throughout the administration's time in office, increasing social mobility has been a strong part of the rhetoric. So it's there in the coalition agreement, and we see it repeatedly thereafter. For example, the 2010 spending review said that it would have social mobility at its heart. In terms of how the government intended to increase social mobility, well, one part of this was investing in the early years, in the foundation years. That's language from Frank Field's report. Frank Field, Labour MP. One of the very first things that the government did was to commission Frank Field to write a report about the early years. He talked about the foundation years, and that also became very much part of what the government said it would do. Secondly, very clear idea that there should be a focus away from spending on income and worrying about family income towards investment in services. So there was a sense, an argument put forward that Labour had gone too far in the direction of worrying about family income, kind of poverty plus a pound sorts of arguments that were put forward, and that there should be a bigger focus on services to tackle and increase social mobility. And thirdly, a very strong focus on tackling educational inequality in two ways: by sweeping reform of our schools, so breaking open the state monopoly and letting other providers come in, and secondly through extra money to follow the poorest pupils. So that's part of that aspect, focus on services. Also worth noting that certainly the Conservative manifesto argued that it would make Britain the most family-friendly country in the world. That language doesn't make it into the coalition agreement in that form, but has, certainly in Cameron's speeches, has come up. Now, in relation to vocational education and apprenticeships, much less, certainly in the coalition agreement, that's about the extent of what they say they're going to do, improve the quality. There's not much further detail on that. And in relation to higher education and further education financing, of course, the coalition found itself in a slightly awkward position because we had the Lib Dems who had made abolishing tuition fees a very important part of what they said they would do. So the coalition agreement says, well, we're going to wait and see what the Brown report says, and we'll take it from there. And if the Lib Dems don't like it, then they can abstain. So a little bit of a fudge on that. So what did this translate to in terms of policies? Well, I'm not going to run through all the policies, just to highlight a few big ones in each area. So for under 5s, probably the only really expansionary policy was the rollout of Labour's pilot of 15 hours free early education to the first 20% of the most disadvantaged 20% of 2-year-olds at first, then 40%. There was a commitment to retaining Sure Start, but to targeting it more closely on families at risk of poor outcomes. And there were revisions to early years curriculum and a shifting with the abandonment of the Every Child Matters framework, a shifting away from a kind of broader idea of child development towards a narrower focus on school achievement. Really important also to highlight cash benefits. We've heard a bit about that this morning. Removal of several benefits from families with babies in particular, including health and pregnancy grant, which gave child benefit to pregnant women, baby tax credit. So some particular removal of benefits in particular from babies, and then also, of course, wider changes which made child tax credit less generous, so affecting families in general. And also that should be seen, of course, in the context down in red at the bottom, of course, of wider changes to benefits which affected families with children, among other families, such as the bedroom tax, such as the overall benefit cap. Overwhelmingly, the families affected by that are households with children.
Okay, and for schools, the government has carried out its sweeping reforms of the school system. So Labour's Academies programme, some would argue that opened the door, but Labour's Academies programme was targeted at struggling schools in disadvantaged areas, and there are only 200 academies roughly in 2010. Now over half of secondary schools are academies, and the coalition turned the programme on its head, so that to start off with, outstanding schools were allowed to convert to academies, and then later extended to good. We've also seen the introduction of free schools, although at this stage not terribly many of them, and the majority in London. The big tackling inequality programme was the Pupil Premium, which appeared in both manifestos. So moving from centralised grants to money following individual pupils, which schools would have the autonomy to use in order to raise their attainment. And then a huge story of reform to what education is and how it's assessed at all levels. So we've seen the curriculum reforms, which really aren't fully implemented yet, but the moves to the linear rather than modular GCSE, the A-level, the AS and the A-level being disconnected. Again, the exam was at the end of the A-level rather than modular, and curriculum being strengthened and assessment throughout to make them more challenging, rigorous, British. Actually, can you not put that on the tape, please? So a massive programme, as I said earlier. 16 to 19 A-levels, also following the Wolf report, vocational programmes of study at 16 to 19 changed to strengthen their general education, maths and English component. At the same time as the raising participation age policy, which was a Labour policy, and implemented is possibly too strong a word. It has happened under this government, but the government decided not to follow through the enforcement measures, and has really done this without any sort of publicity or song and dance. It's come in, and that's the main thing that's driving down the NEET rate that John talked about earlier. But at the same time as encouraging longer participation, the Labour's main measure to enable that, the education maintenance allowance, was abolished and replaced with a smaller 16 to 19 bursary fund. In HE we know that story. Kitty's just said that's the abolition of the teaching grant, and the fee cap increased to £9,000, but in actual fact most universities went very at that or very close. But at the same time, an increase in grants to low-income students, which may explain part of the later story. And then for adults, early on, the government's main policy was to abolish train to gain, which is workplace learning, and the main criticism of this was people who already had those skills and competences were just being accredited for. So they were getting qualification, but probably they weren't actually gaining any extra training. So there's been a big switch from train to gain to apprenticeships. And that's the first wave of policy. And then after the Richard Review in 2012, I think, some serious reforms to increase the length of apprenticeships and their quality. And at the same time, a large-scale cull of vocational qualifications which attract funding. So thousands of qualifications deemed to be of low quality are no longer fundable. And the introduction of adult learning loans for people doing adult qualifications at level 3. Now, one of the most interesting things that we have been musing about this is that agenda is split. The responsibility for that is split across government in many ways. So, family income, including the targeted support for childcare, is in the Department for Work and Pensions. And though there are obviously links, and Kitty's work has spoken to this a lot in the past, there are obviously links between family income and early childhood development. Responsibility for early childhood development. A lot of those services sit with local government through Sure Start and childcare provision, and others through the Department of Health. And although there are links between early childhood development and learning for children when they get across the threshold of 5, learning from 5 to 19 is responsibility of the DFE, including vocational learning from at all ages and for 16 to 19 in FE colleges. But there's also a big role for local government and the Department of Health. And then adult learning and skills, even though that's including vocational learning in FE colleges, is and universities the responsibilities of BIS. So that fragmented structure has always been the case. But one thing we're interested to discuss really is whether it's become more accentuated, partly because we've had a coalition where we've had different ministers from different parties in charge of these different departments. And also because of the government's deliberate withdrawal back to a tighter focus on academic cognitive outcomes, and the renaming of the department, the Department for Education or the Department for Schools and Families, has deliberately tightened this. So in our view, the existing situation makes it hard to develop a coherent lifelong learning or social mobility strategy, but actually these particular circumstances have possibly made things pull in different directions even more so.
Okay, so moving on to think about what happened to funding. As we've heard this morning, the decision, first of all, to focus deficit reduction strategy on spending cuts rather than, predominantly on spending cuts rather than tax increases, plus the decision to protect some areas of spending, some of the big areas of spending, as we've heard, led to other areas taking particularly big hits. So first, in relation to tax benefits, we've seen already families with children most affected by the tax benefit changes. Pensions were protected within social security spending. And here's the graph that John showed earlier, showing you, 6.6% of GDP for pensioners at the end of the period, just as 6.6% of GDP for pensioners at the beginning. In contrast, benefits for working age households with and without children have been squeezed, and those for working age households with children have been squeezed the most, so a reduction from 2.8% of GDP down to 2.3% of GDP, so something like 18% reduction there. When we come on to services, we see this split between the services that have been protected and the others unprotected, and so among the areas that we're talking about today, early childhood not protected, mostly responsibility of local authority and hit really hard by local authority funding cuts. In contrast to schools and 16 to 19 learning under the Department for Education, which have seen their funding hold up, and I'm going to give you some figures in a minute. But then once you move out of schools again and you're into adult learning, again we see those programmes not protected and taking a big hit. So just to put you up some of the figures from 2009-10 to either 2012-13, which is unfortunately the last year for some of this, or 2013-14, you can see that the early education, well, first of all, the schools there, 1% fall in real terms. So cash increase, but a 1% fall in real terms. And similarly, 16 to 19, 2% fall You contrast that to those top areas, which are the ones for young children under 5s. So early education, taking an 11% fall, that's within the direct schools grant. Sure Start, 32% fall, so very similar to what was to the overall cut for local authorities being passed on to Sure Start. Sure Start's ring fence, of course, was removed early on in the Parliament. And then it's not. Then the childcare tax credit is funding that's coming out of the DWP, so that's sort of being squeezed as part of the squeeze on benefits, because that's paid through the benefit system, even though it's part of it's funding that covers childcare costs. So 34% reduction in the childcare tax credit. What I should have put on there is the employer vouchers, which go more to the top half of the distribution, have risen over time. That's a smaller budget than the childcare tax credit. So that doesn't at all cancel out that reduction. But there's also been a bit of a shift away from targeted support for childcare towards less targeted supports. And then down at the bottom, you can see the total adult learning budget down by a quarter. So big differences across the areas.
I wasn't very seamless then, but we didn't put higher education on there. We don't know why we didn't put it on there. But higher education down 44%. Of course, that is really an issue of deferral, because the costs to higher education will be paid for now by the non-paying back of student loans, and work done by Paul's team at IFS suggests that the current scheme is going to be about 5% cheaper in the long term than the system we had already, so perhaps we would put 5% there. So this graph is produced by Steph Thompson, who's sitting in the front row here, who's done a lot of the work on schools and further and higher education. The Pupil Premium controversial policy, was it extra money? Who was it extra money for? Our analysis, and this includes LA maintained schools only, because the Academy's data was not available for this period, shows these are bands of eligibility for the Pupil Premium, ranging from the highest band, 50% and above in the black, to the lowest band under 10%. The average, off the top of my head, is about 20 something, 22. So over this period, we can see that the change in school level income was most positive for the most deprived schools. So it did what it was supposed to do. 7% increase for the most deprived. These are secondary schools. It's primary schools, and about 4% increase for the secondary schools. The most affluent secondary schools actually lost a little bit of money, which was redistributed to the poorer ones. The Pupil Premium, since this point, has gone up in value, so we would expect that to be more pronounced in 2014-15 onwards. And also the Pupil Premium from 2013-14, our analysis shows that it's at that point that it becomes more than the existing grants that it replaced. So it is extra money, and it has been redistributed. But a big point is that the Pupil Premium is only about 2% of the overall spending on schools. So that's not to knock what it's doing in targeting disadvantage, but we might want to look more so at what are the effect of the reforms to curriculum and assessment for disadvantaged children, as well as what is happening with this bit of top-up money.
However, of course, it's interesting to put that picture alongside this one, because, as again we saw earlier today, families with children have lost income, and they've been the families that have done worse overall. Younger people under 15, and particularly people under 4, little people under 4, have lost the most in terms out of the tax benefit reforms over this period. When we contrast to what would have happened if the benefits had just increased in line with earnings without being reformed. And this is particularly interesting picture, I suppose. Well, first of all, if we look at the 0 to 4s, what we've got here is a kind of picture of a double whammy, because they've been hit by the loss, the cuts to Sure Start and to childcare spending, and they're also being hit by reductions in family income. So they've been hit on both sides. If we think about school-age children, it's interesting because on the one hand they're gaining, they've had the schools funding protected, and then the poorer children are gaining from this extra money through the Pupil Premium. But they're losing out money at home through family income. So that fits very much actually into the picture that the government said it wanted to do, which was to focus less on family income. So it's taking money out of household budgets, out of family income, and putting it into schools with a view to schools being a better place to spend that money effectively for children's outcomes. And the sums of money involved are actually pretty similar. So primary pupil premium is £1,300 a year per child, and secondary is £900 a year per child. The IFS calculations of what families have lost range between about £1,000 and £2,000 per household. So families at the lower families, say a workless household or a lone parent, even a lone parent in work, closer to the £2,000 end of that. So you're talking kind of similar amounts of money. And there's no reason, really, evidence doesn't give us confidence that taking money out of the household and putting it into the schools will be a better way to achieve better things for children's outcomes. So in other work that we did at CASE last year, we reviewed all the evidence that's really tried to get at whether family income has a causal effect on children's outcomes. And we found really strong evidence that it does have causal effect, particularly on cognitive outcomes and school achievement, particularly for lower income families. And actually the effect sizes of that money are very similar or larger than the effect sizes that come out of studies that look at how effectively schools are able to spend money in order to improve outcomes for children. And of course, there's many ways of improving outcomes for children, and I think part of what Pupil Premium has done has really tried to make schools think harder about what they're doing and whether they're being more effective. So maybe they will be able to spend that money effectively. But still, the bigger picture that you're taking money away from families and giving schools a much harder job to do, and then giving them money to try and sort out the problem remains. Okay, so I'm going to move on to output, so to thinking about what's actually happened in terms of service delivery, what's bought with this money or what's no longer bought now that there's less money available. So starting with the under fives, the most obvious indicator is a fall in the number of Sure Start centres, down by about 600 over a 4-year period. Government says many of those are merged, but the physical, there are 600 fewer physical centres, so further for families to travel to get to them. In the centres that have remained, there's really impressive evidence that in many areas, service delivery is actually holding up surprisingly well given the extent of funding cuts. And in part that seems to be because in some local authorities are really protecting under 5 services. They're really going out to make sure that early years services are protected and are hitting other services such as youth services, for example, and services for the elderly in order to do that. Whereas in other local authorities, different decisions are being made. So there seems to be an increasing level of postcode lottery, or what's available to you depends on the decisions that your local authority are making. There's also evidence that services within the services offered by centres, even where they're being protected, are falling. So you might have toddler group once a week instead of 3 times a week, or be expected to travel to another Sure Start centre for that. And childcare within Sure Start centres has fallen by about half, so fewer than half the number of Sure Start centres that provided childcare now do so. Very small share, as Ryan said earlier, very small share actually of the total picture of childcare. It's down from about 3% of childcare provided in Sure Start centres to 2%. So it's not changing the landscape for families across the country. However, Sure Start childcare has been found to be higher quality than many other forms of provision, and it's been found to be much better at catering for children with different needs and for disability. So still, perhaps a worrying picture. Sure Start centres also relying on a whole lot of different things, like volunteers and managers working harder, and creativity, this word comes up a lot. So there's concern that whether they'll be able to continue to do what they're doing under further cuts, and they are increasingly targeting services, not just to deal with cuts actually, but because that is part of what government wants them to do. So that may have consequences for ability to identify families, to get them in, and to avoid it becoming a stigmatised service. On the other hand, the 3 and 4 year old places are steady and rising very slightly towards 95% in case of 3s and up towards 100% for 4s. And we do see very positive story on the increased numbers of qualified graduates in private and voluntary sector settings. So that's a really good news story, except that it seems to reflects partly, I think, a growing understanding that graduates are important. It reflects also funding for training and for the graduates themselves that was put in place under the previous government and is gradually being cut and drying up, so it'll be important to watch that. The 2-year-old offer was rolled out, although only 13% of 2-year-olds so far in place, and the budget overall for early education being squeezed, so that those places are not as high quality as we would need them to be for those places to have an effect. So the pilot of the 2-year-old offer said if they had to be high quality, they had to be a graduate. Only 48% of those children are in a place with a graduate.
Schools, I'm not going to say much about this. There's a kind of non-story. The money stayed the same, roughly. Everything roughly stayed the same in terms of class sizes, number of schools, numbers of qualified teachers, etc. It's very not much change there. One thing we haven't said is about the complete overhaul of the teacher training system. So teachers are going to be more teachers are going to be trained primarily through schools. The school direct system. This is under recruiting at the moment. Is it going to be a total disaster, or are these just teething problems? Some of the teacher unions are saying there are concerns about teacher supply. Could be due to the reforms, could be due to the recovering economy, which also always encourages people to go and do other jobs apart from teaching. So it's a little bit too early to tell. So at the moment, it's we've got the same numbers of teachers, there's a little bit extra number of schools and so on, but nothing on big on the outputs front. For further adult and higher education, a bit more change. Interestingly, the controversial abolition of the education maintenance allowance seemed to have a modest effect on participation, so only about 1% of those who would have been eligible are no longer participating, who would have participated in previous cohorts before. But there are concerns coming through from some of the evaluation about the amount, which is lower as for the 16 to 19 bursary, not being enough to adequately support some of the more disadvantaged students. As John said earlier, the proportion NEET at 16 to 18 has fallen for the first time in a decade, and that's largely due to the RPA policy, a little bit to the use contract, I think. And as John said also this morning, despite tuition fees, application rates to university have risen, but there's a big drop of 2/5 for mature and part-time students. The apprenticeships, and it's here we're still talking about the first phase of apprenticeship reform. A big increase in the number of apprenticeships, but that was mainly taken up by over 25. So the government still hasn't tackled. This is one of the enduring thorns in the side of whichever government is called BIS or whatever it's called, whatever it's called through history. How do you get transitions, good transitions from school into the labour market for people who are not going on to university? And we've still got a problem with youth apprenticeships. And overall adult numbers fell by 17%, and the biggest drop has been in the last year since the introduction of adult learning loans. So it looks as though adult learners in vocational education aren't as keen to finance or as able to finance their studies through loans as are young university goers. Here are the university figures. Not only do young people's applications continue to rise, but the socioeconomic gap continues to decline slightly, which isn't what people thought was going to happen. Moving on to outcomes.
Oops. Okay, so outcomes. First of all, this usual caveat that it's very, very early to be looking at outcomes, in part because it's just early and some of the effects of early childhood will take a long time to play out. Then there are the data lags, and there's also a number of really frustrating measurement challenges actually. So a lot of these series have been broken in some way. There's been a change in measurement which it makes it hard, which is always going to make it hard to pick up a very smooth idea of what happened from one administration to the next, and so that leaves us often with just a year of data or 2 years rather than a longer series. But having said all that, let's see what we can look at. I think, first of all, there is some evidence that socioeconomic gaps in some measures that were slowly starting to close until 2009-10 have stopped closing, have stagnated. So that is true of the early years foundation stage profiles. It also, there's some evidence of this from low birth weights, measures of low birth weight. So here we have the percentage of babies born at low birth weight, below 2.5 kilos. And you can see there a pretty flat line for that grey line, which is the professional, managerial, intermediate occupations. And there had been, in the last labour years, a gradual decrease in the percentage of babies born low birth weight in routine and manual occupations in long-term unemployed families, so that you've got this closing of the gap. And since 2009-10, bumpy picture there because of what's happening for the professional managerial, but essentially a sort of a slowing down of progress. So just indicative, something to keep an eye on, and something that suggests something that may be going on. On the other hand, for infant mortality, we see a gap that continues to narrow. It was narrowing and it carries on narrowing, but we only can look at 1 year, 2011 to 2012. And in childhood obesity, we see a gap which was rising because obesity, and this is among 5-year-olds, obesity for children on free school meals was just not shifting from 2006 when data begins to 2011, and it was improving for children who were not on free school meals, so there was an increasing gap, and that stopped rising in that last year.
Okay, so here's the story we can't tell until tomorrow. This is what we know so far. Up until last year, the results continue to improve at all the thresholds at which we measure them, and socioeconomic gaps, which had been decreasing since the mid-2000s, have continued to nudge down. So we don't see a massive pupil premium effect yet, but you probably wouldn't expect to see it because it's only in 2013-14 when the pupil premium gets bigger than any of the money before. But equally, we don't see any increasing child poverty effect, so it just things carry on as they were. But why we decided to hold this off until tomorrow was that from the headline GCSE results, which did come out in December, GCSE results have dropped overall in 2014. Now this dotted line here shows the raw score. I just concentrate on the top line for the minute, the GCSE 5A start to see. The dotted line shows the raw drop, it's 18 percentage points. That is mainly because the qualification rules for what counts in the performance tables have changed. So some qualifications don't count at all anymore. If you do take vocational qualifications, they only count for 1 GCSE, whereas some of them counted for 4 GCSEs. You can only have 2 vocational qualifications counting in any one set of pupils' results, and there'll be 1 or 2. Oh, the other big change, only a student's first attempt as an exam is counted, and there'll be 1 or 2 other changes to discounting rules where the curriculum is the same. So, but this blue line shows, well, if you DFE's very helpfully produced those. I hope someone in the room has done this graph, because it's really helpful to us to have the comparable line, not taking those changes to rules out of the qualification. GCSE results have still dropped by about 5% at 5A star to C, which so this may be because of schools' response to the resit question. So they're only putting people in at the very last attempt once, and those students aren't doing as well as they might have done if they'd had 2 or 3 goes. The other thing that possibly is driving is this is the first year we see the linear GCSE. And given that this trend is most marked for the 5A star to C, that's the lowest threshold that we're now measuring, I suspect that it may be the free school meal students may be more significantly affected by these curriculum assessment changes than other students, and possibly by the early entry, the resit policies as well. So it remains to be seen, but we may see a change in the trend that was shown on the previous graph. We wanted just to tell you that we've been doing this, where Steph has been doing this, has dug out everything that the government used to count. That every child matters. This is a labour of love, really, and tried to track those indicators down now so that we know what's happening to those wider outcomes. But as usual, the problem with this data, most of it's only to 2012 or 13, so this doesn't reflect policy change. It's just giving Steph credit for the many hours of labour digging out all these indicators and saying we will know, in a couple of years we will continue to kind of monitor what's been happening to these. So most of these show that they're either continue to get better. Most of them are on the path that they were on before. They've continued. Only a few have actually got worse since 2010. And interestingly, most of those in the red category are ones related to more vulnerable young people. So care leavers, the outcomes for care leavers. Black people in the youth justice system, child protection outcomes got a little bit worse. SEN statementing, so they tend to be the more vulnerable ones that have got worse. And then 16 to 19, an adult. It's too early to tell. This one, for all the reasons previously given, and because the big reforms. Coming in after the Wolf Report and the Richard Review, I haven't really seen those fully implemented yet. Overall qualifications levels have continued to rise, and this is the graph that John was alluding to this morning. Those really have continued to rise because more people are getting the qualifications at 16 for level 2 or 17 for level 3. But as you might expect, as that cohort expands, the ones who get the qualifications at 16, the ones who aren't getting the qualifications are probably the kind of more difficult to connect with group, and fewer of those, these shaded bars, are getting them at 19 if they didn't get them at 16 to 17. So not necessarily the coalition's fault this, but it's just one of those things that, as the bar rises lower down, we've got a more thorny challenge further on. Predictably, as the number of adult learners fell, so the numbers of adults getting qualifications has fallen quite dramatically. Partly, the government would say, I think that's a good thing, because a lot of adults were getting qualifications that it deemed to be low quality. So it's difficult to tell quite what is funding and what is intent there. Funding restraints and intent. So, moving on. Winning there.
Yep. Oh. So finally, challenges for the next government, whoever they are. Just to summarise some of these. So firstly, we're going to have a persisting inequality, certainly in widening inequality on some measures, such as the financial measures. Within that context, we're seeing falling investment in early childhood, despite the weight of evidence about the importance of early childhood. Ironically, much of this evidence pulled together in a series of independent reviews that the government commissioned in its first years. So it doesn't seem to be for lack of certainly knowledge of this, but somehow for lack of coordination or decisions that have left us not seeing that investment. Rising child poverty, meaning that even services that are seeing investments such as schools are being asked to do a lot more than they might otherwise be asked to do.
As I've alluded to, question mark, curriculum assessment reforms are risking making things harder for the most disadvantaged young people, which leaves a question, is it worse to have some low-grade qualifications that aren't valued in the labour market, or to have none? Is it worth, should we be pushing students to go in for the academic qualifications if they have a high risk of failure? Still insufficient pathways for the other 50% who don't go to university, as all political parties are now onto. And both of those things raise big questions, really, and the ECM, the shift to the narrower agenda, really, are starting to raise some big questions about what education is for. What should we be calling the department that does those things, and what should its coverage, and what constitutes an equitable education system? How should we be measuring that? Is this free? What should we draw from the fact that if the free school meal gap widens next year, is that a good thing or a bad thing? From where I sit in a school of education, there are starting to be people saying, well, we need the next great education debate now. We can't educate ourselves out of inequality, can't necessarily assume that the tightening up of curriculum and assessment is a good thing for disadvantaged young people. So sort of big questions there. And then there's some nasty system questions. How do you get a strategic approach? Is it possible to do this, at least from 0 to 19, if social mobility is the goal? How do you join up these policies? And there's some other difficult ones as well. I think most people think the apprenticeship reforms are a good idea, but how are they going to be paid for? The government wants employers to pay at least half the cost, but the employers are showing, British employers have long showed reluctance to pay for apprenticeships, and it's not clear that that's going to be, if we want this big expansion, how is it going to happen? And the HE funding question is by no means yet resolved, so probably we'll have another review at some point of that. So in a lot of these areas, the next government still has to grapple with a lot of the things that the coalition government was facing in 2010, and it remains to be seen how it does it.
Thank you very much. Absolutely amazing. We have now about 15-20 minutes for questions and comments. You don't have to ask a question if you just have a view on what's been said. That would be helpful as well. I realize it's hard for you to take notes, but I would rather take a couple at a time, and then so that more people have a chance to contribute. So anybody want to kick us off? Yes, please, and please say who you are.
Yeah, I'm Nicola Martin. I'm from London South Bank University. Can you tell me where the Children and Families Act fits into this landscape, please?
All right, another question before Paul, go ahead.
Paul Johnson, the IFS, a very specific question about the attainment gap. You showed, for example, level 2, the attainment gap, portions getting to level 4. My recollection of that was closing. My recollection of the early to mid 2000s, while that was closing, the level 5 gap was opening. Is that stopped, or is that what's happening to the gap of the proportions we're getting to level 5?
Right, should we take those two, because they're quite, well, one very general, one very specific.
Shall I just deal with that's very specific first?
Yeah.
We haven't got the 2014, but there hasn't been correct me if I'm wrong here, there hasn't been a closing of the gap at level 5. You mean key stage 5?
2, no, key stage 2, level 5. So you showed key
stage
yes,
2. I didn't show key stage 2.
Key stage 2 level 4, where there's been a long-term closing of the gap. My recollection is certainly there was an opening of the gap at level 5 at key stage 2 previously.
Key stage 4.
No, at key stage 2.
Sorry, I haven't shown the primary. On the top of the top of my head, the key stage 4, level 4, key stage 2 have continued to decline, and I think there is a bit of a decline at level 5, but I can't remember off the top of the head. So the primary results look better than the. Am I right about that or not?
There's
Reading.
a focus now on making level 4 be the expected level. So there's this idea that the whole reform should shift up the way, and more people should be getting slightly above level 4. So I think, I'm not sure. I don't think that the gap has changed that much.
Right. Okay.
The gap might look smaller at level 5 because only about 30% of kids are getting level 5 in the first place. So the gap might look smaller, but actually, in real terms.
But it was open. There was certainly a period when it was open, when the level 4 gap was closing, level 5 gap was open. And I just wondering whether that's.
Well, there's an interesting parallel with this. Sorry to divert off the question because I can't remember the answer. But no, we don't here. These measures do very closely direct what schools do, don't they? So here, when all these gaps have been closing, the EBAC gap has been widening since the EBAC came in, and it was immediately picked up by the schools with the more middle class children entered people for this. We may see over time that now, when schools see this, they start, changing their entry requirements, and this gap starts to close.
And the question about the
Children and Families Act. Sorry, I'm just quickly trying to mug up on what's in the Children and Families Act. I know we discuss it in here in relation to flexibility of parental leave. Are there specific things that
all that sort of joined up stuff about education, health, and social.
The education and health plans. Yeah,
education, health plans, and all that sort of thing. I just in the sort of 0 to 25 framework and all that sort of thing for the most vulnerable children and everything. I was just trying to sort of get a sense of how it sort of overlays on top of all this, and how much it's a mainstream thing, or how much it is actually sort of very particular and in a sense marginalised because it relates to the most vulnerable children. It's like the sort of every child matters and every disabled child matters connection, isn't it? Today it just felt really peripheral to it all to me, and because I'm in my academic age group with disability studies, to me it's like at the front of my mind, but I'm sort of getting a sense of it now and thinking, how important does everybody else think it is, unless they're people who work in my bit of...
Yeah, so we made some choices here. It's good that you pointed this out, because there's lots and lots of other missing. We've made a choice that we said we're going to focus on socioeconomic inequalities. We've ignored ethnicity, gender and disability. These are quite big things to ignore, and they also, of course, really closely interact. There are very strong relationships between special educational needs. So we haven't really covered that at all now. I'd be interested to know what DFE colleagues think. I looking at from this lens, I have perceived that as to be a fairly, I don't say marginal, but a particular policy area rather than central to the agenda. But that might be my question. I don't know if DFE colleagues would see it in a more integrated way. Anyone want to comment?
I mean, what I would comment on, and this is, clearly as an observer from the last 5 years, is that there is much less emphasis on integration of services and the way services work together, and a much stronger fragmentation between education, health, social care, and that one of the things that I think is happening, but I can't say for sure until we're allowed to publish a report, is that as other services, the entry barriers go higher, the ability to integrate at children's centre level decreases because they can't put the service there. So it's the cuts elsewhere that affect what's available locally in terms of service integration. So I think that the service integration story is really almost gone now, and you see much more clearly there's an education story and a health story, but not a joint story.
In the Children and Families Act, close collaboration between those services sort of underpins the whole thing, so that's quite interesting.
Well, they're still struggling with the 2-year-old check or whatever, review or whatever, that they still can't get, health visitors and early years workers to do some sort of assessment at 2 together. So that's an indication of how difficult this all is.
But that is a very interesting point, that there's been that pressure for integration in that area, whereas schools report that it's more difficult to deliver interagency. Or there's also system structures to support interagency working on no longer so well supported, and they don't have those other outcome targets that they used to have.
Yeah.
So that's it's interesting.
Right. A couple at the front and then at the back.
Yeah. James Ketchum from Centre Forum. It's a while since I looked at your previous work on the Labour years, but I wonder whether there was you could reflect on any sense of longer term trends in over this period, because I guess some of the interventions, so Shore Start would be a good example. That covers a relatively defined period, whereas some of the other trends, say in terms of the GCSE results, might be going over a longer period. So do you have any sense about if you didn't take 2010 as your crunch point, what the trends might be showing?
Yeah.
Can we take the one from the back as well, please?
Hi, Tracy Williams from the Nothing Foundation. I was just posing this question that you posed at the end about integration, and Naomi, you've just picked up on that point as well. I wondered how far you'd had a chance to look at what's happening, or how much of the integration discussion this morning was really about that being a sort of government department issue, and I just wonder whether it's more of a local issue and how far your report was able to kind of comment on whether it's the lack of kind of integrated funding at local level that's resulting in some of those changes. So that was question. I had a very specific data question, which I would have asked if we'd been allowed to ask as you went through about providers versus places and what's happening. Is there good data on the places as opposed to the providers and what?
You mean in childcare?
Yeah, in early years, yeah.
Okay, well on that last point, there are two sources of data and they're a little bit inconsistent actually, and we didn't get to the bottom of why.
Well, it's only because I'm going around that bit
That
myself at
was.
the moment, so I wonder whether
So you've got the registration data, the early years registrations, and then you've got the childcare provider survey, and they're telling slightly different, not dramatically different, but slightly different stories. And I can't quite remember, but I don't think it's possible to tie it up by in terms of, well, one's about, bigger centres are expanding, so places are going up more than settings. So sorry on that one. On the integration, is it local or?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. I think what happens locally is largely driven by what happens, the decisions that are made centrally. So there may well be, local differences in the capacity to join up. But this agenda, to me, seems to be incoherent. If social mobility or education equality is your goal, why take money away from families and give it to schools? Why cut the early years and invest from 5 and then cut adults? It doesn't seem to be, and those are the big decisions that drive where the money goes.
Take it out of local authorities, I suppose that's part of the question. Who
could join it? Well, that's really interesting. Why not give children to local authorities? And
That's one that you made any comments on that.
No, we haven't, but it's worth thinking about. And in fact, things are really going in the opposite direction because local authorities are losing their both in education, where more and more funding is devolved to the schools, and in childcare, where more and more funding. There's an sense that local authorities aren't. It's a sort of waste if it's sitting at the local authority level doing those kind of coordinating things. So I think there's increasingly a bit of a vacuum, not just for funding, not just because of the squeeze on funding, but also because they're required to pass more down to the settings.
A classic example of that is the career service. So responsibility for careers education now rests with schools, who don't have to use the national careers service. So there's an age, transition through age problem, but there's also the desire to have an autonomous, self-improving school system may make it more difficult for young people to negotiate transitions into the workplace. So it's a bit hodgepodge at the moment.
And have we lost your question?
So here's the very interesting question that you raised. Here are the trends from 2004 5, this is for overall GCSE, and from this point, which is when the wider range of vocational qualifications were introduced, you see a gradual narrowing of the free school meal gap, and then that ramps up after 2008, which was possibly a national challenge effect. So the gaps have been narrowing over time, and they've continued. But this drop suggests that most at the free school, at the 5 A's to C measure, most of the gain was made by the increasing vocational qualifications, which was what people were worried about. But of course, the counter-argument to that is that those qualifications engaged some young people who wouldn't have been engaged at all before. And they might have gone on to gain other qualifications, or at least to have a learning path after school, even if those particular qualifications they gained didn't really have the weight of 4 GCSEs when they went into the labour market. And I don't think that is all really properly explored. I don't think people have very different views on the value, what the value of a qualification is. So you could certainly argue, well, there we go then. That demonstrates that was all nonsense, and that these weren't real gains, it was grade efficient. And the focus on A's to C was right, because that's held up despite on English and Maths rather, as held up despite that. But I do think that that's a more complicated debate that's going to need to be had after tomorrow's free school meal results. I feel sure that someone in the room knows the answer to this free school meal question. I can't reveal it.
No, I suggested, sorry to put my in, but I did suggest I might have had early access to it this morning, but actually my early access doesn't give me access to the national figures. Only school figures. So it's not available until tomorrow morning. I'm not sure it's going to get worse at GCSE, but we'll see tomorrow.
Right, okay. So we could have
Possibly
published
only
today.
because overall results have gone down, and ironically the gap might not get worse. But perhaps because of the results going down, sadly.
Right, it's 1:45. Yes, let's have.
Sean Hayes, I work in Hounslow Council, so I am at least one local authority person in the room. And we still are an integrated children's service with education and social care, at least supposed to be working together. I mean, one of the massive cuts in local authorities has been the reduction in school improvement services. I mean, completely decimated in the last 5 years. So once there may be a will to integrate and work together, there are a lot fewer people around to do it. So that doesn't help. I mean, one of the most depressing bits around that is there don't appear to have been any improvements in educational outcomes for looked after children. And one observation I made in a different forum a couple of years ago was, maybe if we are going to make the Pupil Premium work for our most vulnerable children, such as look after children, instead of giving them 1900 each, we give them a massively exponentially greater amount, because actually their needs are so great, and we give them something like 7 or 8 or 10,000 per child, as opposed to 1900. The impact of that might make a difference. As a proportion of children who receive Pupil Premium, they're quite small in terms of the quantum, so actually it wouldn't have a big deflationary effect on the amount everybody else entitled would get, but it might make a difference for their outcomes overall, which are still in England powerless.
Can I just ask you, do you think that would, if that went to the school, would you not still be left with this problem that you devolve that to the school? You may have schools that are better or worse at spending it. They may not be able to, you want to buy in one day of some kind of support and one day of another kind of support. And if that's not available at local, I know increasingly that's not available at local authority level. So would it be better to have that money held at local authority level for schools to draw on resources?
Yeah. Well, actually, the local authorities are now much more able to hold back quite a bit more of that. In fact, most of it. I think local authorities are getting better in this joint context in terms of running virtual schools, virtual colleges. And we are, certainly my lived experience in Hounslow is that we are now much more serious about how we devolve the money and how we expect schools to identify how they're spending it. In the same way, obviously, take a general stance around ensuring schools are using it appropriately. We know examples where, of course, schools haven't used Pupil Premium entirely appropriately, they're still spending it in business. But I think if we do work together with our schools, we look after children in place, and we do have a strategic view of how it's spent, then I think perhaps we could change outcomes. But it does involve, even in Hounslow we have 200 kids in our virtual school. They're all over England. It is very hard to manage it, but we are getting better at it.
Right. Do you two want to make any final comments? Are you? Right. As always, I will make a couple of final comments. Thank you very much. I mean, it's really, really interesting, and I haven't read the report yet. I just looked at the slides. I got an early look at the slides. I suppose my final comment is a couple of the things that I almost always say, is that money is essential but not sufficient. So that argument about is it money or is it, it's just a stupid argument. It's a stupid argument. Money is essential, but it doesn't automatically mean things are going to get better, but it's very hard to make them better without the money. So I think that's important, and it's how you spend the money. I think the other thing that I think we need to think much more carefully about is, what is it possible for government to do? And there are some very straightforward things government can do, like massively improve the quality of early education by putting a teacher in every single childcare place. And that costs money, but it's much easier to do than making parents take parenting courses. It's just easier. You know, and in terms of impact, it would have impact on a much larger group of children, particularly poor children. So it's the feasibility of the policy in terms of what it's possible to change, as well as what evidence tells us works, that I think we have to think about. And the last one is about the sort of interagency. I agree with you that a lot of it is driven from the top, but I would also say, at least my experience from working locally at the very ground level, it's love and money. And it's the extent to which local practitioners get on with each other and are willing to answer the phone or return the call that makes interagency work. You know, it really, really is about relationships at local level and then at middle management level. It's relationships from the bottom up, not just from the top down. Because no matter how much the center tells you to do it, if you don't feel like doing it, it's not going to happen. So I think those are the sort of the sort of more nuanced issues that make things for better or for worse. Thank you very much. I'm extremely grateful to the team for an amazing piece of work that, and I have to read the whole thing, I think, but, and I'm very proud that Trust for London was able to be part of it. So well done, and thank you all for coming.